I didn't scream, I didn't throw punches, and I definitely didn't threaten anyone. When the certified letter landed in my mailbox claiming I had abandoned 47 acres of Texas land, I just set it on the kitchen table, poured myself black coffee, and stared out at the dam my grandfather built in 1978. 47 acres that had carried my family's name since before the city had a Starbucks on every corner. 47 acres where my pops taught me to hunt, where my mother planted pecan trees, and where I buried my first dog under the oak by the bend of Willow Creek. Now, apparently, those acres were suddenly the crown jewel of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, who had just built 35 homes on the back portion like it was their own personal monopoly board. The audacity should have knocked me flat. Instead, it made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled coffee on the eviction notice. The first time I saw the new houses, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. Neat cul-de-sacs with fake cobblestone driveways and little white mailboxes lined up like toy soldiers stood exactly where my cattle pasture used to be. I slowed my truck, blinked twice, and wondered if deployment had scrambled my sense of direction. Nope. Same cedar trees, same dusty gravel road, same dam glinting in the afternoon sun. Only now it overlooked rows of beige McMansions stuffed so close together they looked like they were sharing walls, even when they technically weren't. A man in a neon vest waved me down and told me I was trespassing on HOA property. I nearly asked him if he was drunk. Instead, I told him the land he was standing on still carried my grandfather's deed, which was older than his hard hat. He squinted like I'd just spoken in Russian, then waved me off with the confidence of someone who truly believed paperwork signed by an HOA committee was stronger than a century-old water rights deed. By the time I parked in my own driveway, there were already rumors buzzing online. Neighbors whispering about the troubled veteran who lived in the old farmhouse at the edge of paradise. Someone had posted on the Nextdoor app warning families to keep children away from the unstable property owner. The profile picture belonged to none other than Margaret Thornwell, president of the HOA and self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates. She wore her tennis visor even in the headshot, like a general in pastel armor. Margaret had lived here for precisely 2 years, but she spoke as though her bloodline had tilled the Texas soil since the Alamo. Her power came not from law, but from sheer certainty that whatever she believed, the city would back her up. At first, I tried the polite route. I attended an HOA meeting, sitting in a row of folding chairs next to retirees, clutching styrofoam coffee cups. Margaret introduced me to the crowd as Mr. Morrison, who is struggling with some land paperwork. I corrected her. Actually, it's your paperwork that's confused. My land was never for sale. She smiled, thin as a razor blade, and replied that community growth required sacrifices. I asked if she considered bulldozing a veteran's cattle pasture without permission a sacrifice or a crime. Gasps. Margaret dabbed her temple with a monogrammed napkin, pretending my words had caused her faintness. Her husband, Rick, who sat near the back, whispered something to another board member, and suddenly the meeting moved on without another word to me. That night, I walked out to Pop's Dam. The crickets were loud, the air thick with cedar pollen, and the water shimmered under the moonlight like a secret. I crouched by the old spillway gates, ran my hand along the rusted levers, and felt the kind of calm you only get from knowing patience is sharper than anger. Pops had built this dam with help from the Army Corps, which meant every bolt, every concrete slab, was backed by federal jurisdiction. They couldn't bulldoze that. They couldn't file it away in county records with a smirk and a signature. They could build their cul-de-sacs, they could patrol with golf carts, they could smear me online, but water has its own kind of memory. Water remembers its path, and when it decides to return home, no tennis visor or fake cobblestone can stop it. The weeks that followed were an absurd chess game. Inspectors arrived at my farmhouse, claiming my porch was structurally unsound. Animal control accused me of neglecting livestock I hadn't owned in 3 years. The city council suddenly decided my septic tank was a hazard. Every piece of paper reeked of Rick's influence. It was intimidation by bureaucracy, and I recognized it instantly. Afghanistan had taught me plenty about infrastructure, but it had also taught me about bullies with pens. They push until they think you'll snap. I didn't. I documented. Photos, flow measurements, drone footage, every letter neatly stacked in binders. Margaret and her tennis-clad patrol smiled at me from golf carts, waving like neighbors, while quietly filing reports about my unstable behavior. Then came the letter announcing eminent domain proceedings. They offered me $180,000 for property appraised at $900,000. Their reasoning? Public safety. They argued the dam was unstable and endangered the subdivision. I almost admired the strategy. If you can't steal land quietly, declare it dangerous and lowball the owner until he's forced to sell. But Pop's journals sat in my attic, filled with diagrams, notes, and signed permits proving federal oversight. My fingers trembled as I turned those pages. This wasn't just land. This was legacy, law, and leverage all wrapped into one. And while Margaret whispered about children's safety, I was calculating water volumes in my head, running numbers like I used to run supply lines overseas. One night, as thunder rumbled low on the horizon, I realized something Margaret hadn't. Those 35 houses, built in record speed to secure insurance payouts, sat directly in the natural floodplain Pop's Dam had been designed to protect. They weren't just vulnerable. They were doomed the moment someone redirected the creek. I leaned against the iron gate controls, listened to the hollow echo of water pulsing underneath, and smiled. Patience, I reminded myself. Let them build higher. Let them plant their manicured lawns and decorate their faux creek beds with landscaping stones. The higher they stack their illusion of control, the sweeter the sound would be when water reminded them whose land this really was. That was the night I decided I wouldn't just fight them in court. I would fight them with engineering. In nature, unlike HOA bylaw, the first storm came early, a September squall that rolled across the plains like a dark army. I stood at the dam before dawn, watching clouds turn the sky into a bruise while the subdivision slept with their security lights blinking. The rain wasn't biblical, not yet, but the creek swelled like it remembered where it used to run. Water pressed against the gates, whispering against concrete in a rhythm only I could hear. 35 driveways downstream glistened under the street lamps, oblivious to the fact that Pop's spillway was the only reason their houses weren't already standing in knee-deep mud. By noon, the HOA had gathered in Margaret's driveway, a semicircle of umbrellas and anxious voices. From the edge of my property, I watched her address the crowd like a preacher at a Sunday tent revival. She pointed at the dam, raised her voice over the rain, and declared it a ticking time bomb. I half expected her to pass a collection plate for donations toward her next Mercedes. Homeowners clutched their kids closer, and more than one man in golf attire nodded gravely, as if my grandfather's earthwork structure had woken that morning with homicidal intent. What Margaret didn't know was that the dam had passed inspection every single year for 4 decades. The real danger wasn't the structure. It was her construction crews blocking the natural creek bed with decorative concrete channels that looked good on brochures but collapsed under real water pressure. 2 days later, an inspector showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, his slicked hair plastered to his forehead. He circled the farmhouse, poked at beams with a screwdriver, then scribbled a note about significant safety concerns. I asked him what exactly those concerns were. He muttered something about city council directives and refused to look me in the eye. When I reminded him Pop's Dam was under federal oversight, his pen froze mid-sentence. He cleared his throat, closed his clipboard, and left without another word. Later, I learned his brother-in-law had just won a concrete contract with Rick Thornwell's company. Connections everywhere, like tangled roots choking out oxygen. It wasn't enough for them to steal the land. They needed to make me look like a lunatic. Margaret started posting online about unpredictable outbursts from the man at the old farmhouse. She never mentioned my name, but her followers didn't need it. One grainy photo of me checking the dam gates at midnight turned into neighborhood gossip about armed patrols. A local paper ran a headline, "Troubled Veteran Threatens HOA Development." The article quoted Margaret extensively, her words carefully chosen, laced with sorrow and civic duty. "We only want what's safe for the children," she said, her smile practically audible through the print. I could have fought fire with fire, started my own media campaign, shouted the truth from rooftops. Instead, I chose something sharper: documentation. Every creek diversion, every truckload of concrete, every suspicious late-night visit from security contractors got photographed, time-stamped, and logged. I wasn't emotional about it. I was surgical. War zones had taught me that chaos favors whoever stays calm long enough to cut through the noise. Let Margaret flood the airwaves with her syrupy outrage. I was building a case made of steel and water. Then came the twist I hadn't planned for. My sister Sarah. She called from California, voice thin and brittle. "Jake, some woman just showed up at my house." My grip on the phone tightened. Margaret had flown across the country, dressed in tennis whites, and introduced herself at Sarah's door. She claimed she was worried about me, about my mental health, about how I might hurt myself, or worse, someone else. She suggested Sarah sign a transfer of property for my safety. Sarah may know nothing about Texas water law, but she knows a vulture when one lands on her porch. She laughed Margaret out of her driveway, then called me in tears, half terrified, half furious. I calmed her down, assured her I had it under control, and quietly added interstate harassment to my growing binder of evidence. The rain kept coming. Not constant, but steady enough to feed the reservoir. My measurements showed water volume rising closer and closer to capacity. Each night, I calculated numbers, tested levers, and double-checked emergency release paths. I wasn't plotting vengeance. I was preparing for inevitability. Water doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate with committees. It simply finds the lowest point and keeps moving. And the lowest point, as it turned out, ran straight through Willowbrook Estates. Margaret escalated in predictable fashion. She formed a safety patrol of 3 HOA board members who parked SUVs at my property line. They wore matching polos with embroidered logos, clipboards in hand, writing down license plates of every vehicle that entered. When the mailman delivered packages, they snapped photos. When my neighbor Miguel stopped by with tamales, they demanded to see his ID. It was intimidation theater, suburban cosplay of authority. One evening I walked up to their folding table, offered them a cold beer, and asked how long they planned to keep up the show. Their faces flushed crimson. One muttered about public duty. I left them to their clipboards, my smile sharp as barbed wire. But the real gut punch arrived in a crisp, white envelope, a city order for eminent domain. The council claimed my land needed to be seized for public safety infrastructure. They offered a payout insultingly low, barely enough to buy a condo in downtown Austin. The kicker? The order was signed by none other than Councilman Rick Thornwell. My pulse thudded in my ears, not from panic but from clarity. They weren't just overreaching, they were leaving fingerprints all over the crime scene. The arrogance was astonishing, but arrogance always leaks into paperwork eventually. That night, I poured whiskey into Pop's old mason jar and sat by the spillway controls. The air was heavy with rain and cedar, the water restless beneath the gates. My grandfather's words echoed from a yellow journal entry. The creek belongs to the land, not the men who fence it. For the first time, I felt a sliver of peace. The HOA had written their own trap, and nature would be the rope. I wasn't going to swing wildly in court. I was going to open these gates, let the water carve its rightful path, and watch illusions drown under the weight of reality. When dawn broke, the subdivision was quiet, blinds drawn tight against the storm. I tightened my boots, set my coffee mug on the concrete ledge, and traced the iron handles of the spillway. Not yet. Timing mattered. But soon. Very soon. By the time September dragged into October, the neighborhood had split into 2 camps. On one side, the HOA diehards with their manicured hedges and curated outrage. On the other, the old-timers and farmers who had quietly begun knocking on my door. Word traveled fast in towns like ours, especially when water was involved. Miguel Santos showed up first, hat in hand, eyes weary. His family's farm downstream had been bone dry since the HOA's contractors shoved concrete across the creek bed. Behind him came Mrs. Chun, whose vegetable garden had shriveled into dust. They didn't ask for vengeance. They asked for water. It's funny how entitlement looks when it's wrapped in pastel tennis skirts versus when it's carved in a sunburned wrinkle from 50 years of farm work. Margaret clutched pearls about community safety. Miguel held photos of his father's crops from the 80s, lush and green thanks to Pop's dam. Mrs. Chun brought a mason jar of soil, dry and crumbling in her hands. Their desperation wasn't political, it was survival. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about saving my land. It was about restoring everyone's. The HOA sensed the tide shifting, and Margaret doubled down. She arranged a press conference on the cul-de-sac, complete with local news crews and a carefully chosen backdrop of mothers with strollers. She painted me as a dangerous veteran with military training in water warfare, claiming I was preparing to unleash catastrophic floods. Her voice cracked at all the right moments, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue like she'd rehearsed it. The cameras loved her. Neighbors nodded solemnly. And for about 12 hours, she had the narrative in her grip. Then the rain came. Hard, relentless sheets that filled Pop's reservoir faster than I'd ever seen. While Margaret was still clutching microphones, drone footage surfaced online showing water backing up against the HOA's decorative barriers. Streams of runoff twisted through backyards, creeping toward patios and swimming pools. The story flipped overnight. Instead of a dangerous veteran, the newscasters began asking why a subdivision was built smack in the middle of a floodplain. Margaret tried to pivot, but her charm wilted under the glare of reality. Water doesn't lie. The pressure on me mounted. City officials began showing up unannounced. One evening, the fire chief arrived with 3 deputies, claiming my dam was imminent danger. I invited them inside, offered coffee, and set down every binder documentation I'd been collecting. Federal permits, inspection reports, water flow measurements, all neat, all indisputable. The fire chief, to his credit, flipped through the evidence, frowned, and muttered that none of this had been mentioned in the council's briefing. He left looking more rattled than convinced. That was enough. Doubt had seeped in, but the HOA wasn't finished. Late one night, floodlights blazed across my field. I grabbed my flashlight and caught 2 men in tactical vests pouring quick-set concrete into the spillway channels. They weren't homeowners. They were hired muscle. Their excuse was pathetic. Community volunteers protecting infrastructure. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone while recording them. The sheriff arrived within the hour, shaking his head as he cuffed them. Margaret rushed to the scene, shrieking about false arrests, but the concrete dust on their gloves told the whole story. Sarah called again from California, voice sharp with worry. "Jake, this is getting dangerous. Please tell me you're not planning something crazy." I wanted to lie, to tell her I'd sit quietly and wait for the courts. But Pop's journals sat on my desk, his handwriting looping across yellowed paper. Neighbors share water. That's how we survive. The weight of those words anchored me. I told Sarah I was fine, that I wasn't planning revenge. What I didn't say was that I was planning restoration. Behind the scenes, alliances formed. Amanda Cross, a lawyer known for environmental cases, offered pro bono help after seeing drone footage online. She wasn't in it for money. She wanted precedent. She explained that if we proved the HOA had diverted a federal waterway without permits, it wouldn't just be a civil slap on the wrist. It would be federal crime. Her words were crisp, her confidence unsettling even to me. "We don't need to beat them in a shouting match," she said. "We need to drown them in facts." The twist came when Amanda dug deeper into records. She found the HOA's insurance applications for the subdivision. They had flat out lied, claiming the development was outside a floodplain and that the creek diversion was temporary. Fraud on that scale wasn't just shady, it was criminal. The moment she told me, my hands tingled. This wasn't about me versus Margaret anymore. This was about dismantling an entire scheme. Meanwhile, Margaret kept pushing her theater. She organized a safety patrol live stream from golf carts, broadcasting their heroic defense against my supposed plots. One clip showed a patrol member dramatically pointing at the dam, declaring it unstable and about to burst. The comments section roasted them alive. "Looks like the dam is older than your Botox," one user wrote. Another, "Imagine building on a floodplain and blaming gravity." For the first time, Margaret's control of the narrative cracked. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. People like her don't collapse quietly. They implode spectacularly. And sure enough, the HOA filed for an emergency restraining order. They wanted me barred from tampering with dam infrastructure. In other words, barred from touching my own property. Amanda counterfiled with Pop's original covenant, proving I had a legal duty to maintain seasonal flow. The judge scheduled a hearing in 2 weeks. 2 weeks was too long. The storms were coming faster, harder, heavier. Water wasn't waiting for court dates. The night before the hearing, I stood alone at the dam, flashlight beam catching on rusted iron. The reservoir was full to the brim, restless and straining. My calculations showed one more storm would push it over capacity. If I didn't open the gates, the pressure might do it for me, uncontrolled and dangerous. The irony stung. They'd accuse me of planning chaos when the real chaos was their own construction. My choice was simple: open the gates with precision, or let nature do it without mercy. I leaned against the controls, listening to the hum of water under concrete. Pop's voice seemed to echo from memory. Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek. My pulse slowed. The decision was clear. The next storm would be my storm. Not vengeance. Not sabotage. Just restoration. And Margaret? She had no idea her subdivision was about to learn what gravity and federal law sound like when they speak in unison. The morning of the court hearing smelled of wet cedar and diesel fuel. I put on my best suit, the one I hadn't touched since Pop's funeral, and drove into town with Amanda riding shotgun. She looked over her notes, lips moving silently as she rehearsed. I didn't bother. I knew my testimony by heart. Dates, measurements, photographs, maps etched into my memory like scar tissue. The courthouse buzzed with reporters. Margaret arrived, flanked by her entourage in pastel suits, cameras catching her practice frown as though she'd just been personally betrayed by the state of Texas. Inside, the courtroom was theater. Margaret dabbed her eyes with tissues, painting herself as a reluctant warrior defending the safety of children. Rick, smug in his tailored suit, whispered to their lawyer like he was orchestrating a chessboard. The HOA's case was simple. The dam was a hazard. I was unstable, and the subdivision required protection. Amanda rose calmly, her voice steady as she unveiled our evidence. Pop's federal permits, inspection records, floodplain maps showing the HOA's homes directly in harm's way. When she presented the insurance fraud documents, the room shifted. Even the judge leaned forward. Margaret's smile tightened until it cracked. But before a ruling could come, thunder boomed outside, shaking the windows. Reporters bolted for the doors. The storm had arrived early, pounding rain against the courthouse roof. Amanda looked at me sharply. If that reservoir is full, this could get ugly. I didn't answer. I already knew. By the time I reached the dam that afternoon, the reservoir was a furious ocean. Water slapped against concrete, straining to break free. My boots sank into mud as I fought the wind, gripping the iron handles. Behind me, headlights bobbed through the storm, trucks, SUVs, a whole convoy. Margaret herself emerged from the lead vehicle, visor still perched absurdly on her head despite the sheets of rain. She marched toward me, screaming over the thunder. "You open those gates, and you'll kill families," she shrieked, rain streaking her mascara. "You'll go to prison for the rest of your life." I almost laughed at the irony. 35 houses built on my land, and she wanted me to believe the dam was the crime. I shouted back, "Your houses shouldn't exist. You put them in a floodplain." She ignored the words, too invested in her performance. Behind her, homeowners clutched umbrellas, some wide-eyed with fear, others glaring at me like I was the villain in their HOA newsletter. Miguel appeared from the opposite side, his truck bed loaded with sandbags. Mrs. Chun held a tarp over her head, yelling for neighbors to see the truth. More locals arrived, their voices cutting through the storm. It wasn't just me anymore. It was a crowd, split between the illusion of HOA safety and the raw honesty of water rights. Margaret's control was slipping with every raindrop. Then, the ground gave a warning groan. One of the HOA's decorative concrete channels downstream cracked, collapsing into a slurry that swallowed a backyard fence hole. Screams pierced the storm. Homeowners scrambled back, faces pale as their manicured lawns dissolved into muddy torrents. I didn't need to say a word. Nature was doing the talking. Still, Margaret wasn't finished. She rushed at me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "Don't you dare touch that gate. I'll have you arrested for terrorism." Her voice broke on the last word. For the first time, I saw fear, not of water, but of losing control. That's all this ever was for her. Not community, not safety. Control. I leaned close, rain dripping from my chin. "This water doesn't belong to you." It never did. Then I pulled the lever. The gate screamed as metal shifted, rust grinding against rust. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the roar of water erupted, a sound older than civilization itself. The flood surged forward, carving through the blocked creek bed, tearing down ornamental landscaping and swallowing decorative stone bridges like toys. The subdivision shrieked under its weight, lawns vanishing, cul-de-sacs drowning, golf carts spinning helplessly in the current. Yet it wasn't chaos. It was controlled release, precisely measured. The spillway channeled the surge into the natural path Pops had designed, bypassing houses that never should have existed but sparing lives. It was engineering, not revenge. The water moved with purpose, not malice. And as it flowed, the truth became undeniable. The dam had never been the danger. The HOA's arrogance had. Reporters filmed from the ridge, their cameras capturing Margaret's visor floating downstream like a surrender flag. Homeowners screamed at her, some in fury, others in disbelief. "You said it was safe," one man bellowed, his voice breaking as he held a soaked toddler. Margaret tried to shout back, but her words drowned under the roar of water and the rage of neighbors. Rick was nowhere to be seen. I stood firm, hands on the gate handles, rain soaking me to the bone. For the first time in months, I felt light. Not triumphant, just clear. The water was where it belonged. Pop's dam had done its job, and Margaret, for all her noise, was just another figure washed clean by the current of truth. By midnight, the rain eased. The floodwaters settled into new channels. Restoring flowed downstream, where Miguel's farm and Mrs. Chin's garden drank deep for the first time in years. Fire trucks and emergency crews swarmed the subdivision, lights flashing against ruined lawns. Reporters swarmed too, microphones shoving into Margaret's face. For once, she had no words. Amanda arrived, coat plastered to her shoulders, eyes shining with both relief and calculation. "You didn't just win the hearing," she told me quietly. "You just proved their fraud to the entire city. On camera." I looked at the dam, at the water still rushing through the spillway, at the faces of neighbors divided between gratitude and rage. This wasn't over. There would be lawsuits, accusations, maybe even handcuffs. But the balance had shifted. The HOA's illusion had cracked wide open, and everyone had seen the water pour through. As I trudged back to the farmhouse, boots heavy with mud, I realized Margaret's greatest weapon, her control of the narrative, was gone. From here on out, the story wasn't hers to tell. It was mine, and water has a way of carrying stories. The morning after the flood felt eerily calm, the kind of silence that follows a storm but hums with unfinished business. I sat on my porch, coffee steaming in one hand, Pop's journal in the other. The creek behind the farmhouse gurgled like it was celebrating freedom, and for the first time in years, Mrs. Chin's roosters crowed loud enough to carry across the valley. Nature had reclaimed its rhythm. But the world of men, lawyers, and politics was just waking up, and I knew Margaret wouldn't stay quiet for long. By noon, the media vans were parked up and down the gravel road. Headlines screamed their contradictions. Veteran saves valley or troubled soldier floods suburb. Some reporters leaned toward the truth, others toward spectacle. Either way, Margaret's HOA nightmare was now public property. She'd held a press conference that morning, standing in front of the wrecked subdivision with her pearls glistening and her voice trembling. She accused me of weaponizing water, of destroying 35 families' American dream. She even called me unfit to own land, citing my military service like it was a liability. What she hadn't counted on were the neighbors she'd trampled along the way. Miguel Santos appeared on local television, showing maps and photographs of his family's farm drying up after the creek diversion. Mrs. Chun, usually soft-spoken, held up jars of dried soil from her garden and explained how Margaret's construction strangled an ecosystem. Their voices cracked her polished veneer in a way my calm sarcasm never could. For the first time, the story wasn't veteran versus HOA. It was community versus corruption. Still, Margaret wasn't done swinging. That afternoon, I was served with a lawsuit: reckless endangerment, property destruction, emotional distress. Her lawyer delivered it with the smugness of a man who thought paperwork could hold back a river. Amanda scanned the pages, her mouth twitching at the absurdity. "This is weak," she said, "but it'll clog the courts for months if they can help it." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "Good thing we got something bigger." She wasn't kidding. Tony Riggs called that evening from Washington, his voice brisk with excitement. The EPA had opened a formal criminal investigation into the HOA for violations of the Clean Water Act and insurance fraud. Federal agents had enough evidence to freeze their development accounts and subpoena Rick Thornwell's city council records. "You didn't just pull a lever, Jake," Tony said. "You pulled the rug out from under them." The next twist came faster than I expected. Rick resigned from city council 2 days later, citing personal reasons. In reality, he was cornered. Bank regulators had discovered forged environmental assessments tied directly to his construction company. Without insurance or financing, the entire Willowbrook Estates project collapsed overnight. Work crews abandoned equipment mid-pour. Trucks sat idle, cement hardening in their drums like gravestones for bad decisions. Homeowners who trusted Margaret screamed for refunds that would never come. Margaret, though, clung to denial. She marched through the half-built streets in her tennis visor, shouting at contractors to return, demanding neighbors sign petitions to condemn my property. Cameras followed her every move, catching the absurd spectacle of a woman insisting she held power while the ground literally sank beneath her. It might have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. The court hearing a week later was packed, standing room only. Reporters, neighbors, environmental groups, even students from the university's law school crowded in to watch. Amanda presented a wall of evidence: Pop's covenant requiring seasonal flow, the EPA's inspection records confirming natural flooding patterns, the insurance documents riddled with lies. Then came the community testimony. Miguel spoke of 3 generations lost to a dry creek bed. Mrs. Chun brought jars of restored water from her garden, holding them up like holy relics. Even Fire Chief Martinez testified that the spillway release had prevented catastrophe, not caused it. When Margaret took the stand, her performance was operatic. She wept, she wailed, she accused me of harboring revenge fantasies. But when Amanda produced records of her Houston HOA paying millions in EPA fines for the same scam, the courtroom gasped. Margaret froze mid-sentence, like a puppet with its strings cut. Rick, sitting in the gallery, bolted for the exit. It was the sound of a story collapsing in real time. The judge's ruling was swift. The dam was lawful, the water release justified, and the HOA's claims baseless. He ordered the subdivision to cease construction indefinitely and referred evidence of fraud to federal prosecutors. Margaret's face drained of color. For once, she had no speech prepared. The aftermath was almost surreal. The HOA dissolved within months, bankrupted by legal fees and fines. Margaret disappeared from the public eye, rumored to have sold her house and moved out of state. Rick pleaded guilty to fraud and conflict of interest, sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The half-finished McMansions were eventually bulldozed, their lots reclaimed by prairie grass and wildflowers. As for me, life didn't return to what it was. It grew into something new. I restored Pop's farmhouse, reinforced the dam, and set up a small environmental consultancy, helping other landowners fight similar battles. Amanda stayed on, more than a lawyer now, someone who had stood in the storm with me. Miguel's farm thrived again. Mrs. Chin's garden overflowed, and the creek sang its way through the valley as if it had never been silenced. Every Sunday, I bring a mason jar of creek water to Pop's grave. I pour it gently over the earth and tell him the truth. The land is safe, the water flows, and the bully's lost. Margaret thought she could control nature, but Pops always said the same thing. Water finds its way,